everyone, welcome to the December 31st New Year's Eve edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona. My usual co-host Craig Milkowski still on vacation. He'll be returning in the new year, but I've had a series of guests on over the past few weeks, and this week I'm happy to have on guest handicapper Nick Tammaro. Nick, you're somebody who's worn a lot of hats in racing. I know you like to focus on Aqueduct with the handicapping, but you're somebody who's had a lot of different gigs. I know you're excited about the Sam Houston track announcer position, which will be starting for you coming up next week. Welcome back to the podcast, and I'm sure you're looking forward to that.
I appreciate it. Yeah, definitely looking forward to it, and I think I'm trying to try out as many different things as I can to see if I'm good at any of them. So the more you try, the more you spread yourself out, the higher the likelihood that you might actually do reasonably well. But no, I'm glad to be joining you, and of course, New York racing always feels like home for me, having been a public handicapper for New York, the entire circuit on and off for going on 13 years now. So very excited to join you for what amounts to a pretty decent sequence.
I feel like that's the case for a lot of us in horse racing, trying out different things to see what we like best. But I know the handicapping for you and I is a passion, and New York tracks are what we like to focus on. So let's make Aqueduct the focus on Saturday, that New Year's Day card, January 1st. Their feature there is the Jerome Stakes, their first in a series of Derby preps. Not sure we'll see many of these horses showing up in the Wood Memorial, 2 or 3 preps down the line, but we'll see if any of these 3-year-olds that we're seeing running on Saturday take a big step forward. But it's a pretty good card at Aqueduct. Some interesting races in that late pick 5 sequence, and that late pick 5 will be the focus for us on this podcast. Nick, the sequence starts off with race 5. It's a 6-furlong New York Brit special, a maiden special weight race for the newly turned 3-year-olds. How did you see this one shaping up? Because you got a couple of horses coming out of that December 5th maiden affair that both ran reasonably well, and I imagine they're going to take the bulk of the money in here.
Yeah, and I remember immediately after this race, you tweeted about how Impressionist was particularly impressive in defeat, and going into that race, Agility, the eventual winner, was a very heavy favorite who had run well on debut at Belmont and came back and probably took a reasonable step forward. I don't think moved up the Beyer speed figure scale too immensely, but certainly was a little bit more polished at second asking. And I thought Impressionist was impressive in running third, given the start. He was off to a very, very poor beginning, ended up losing a ton of ground, came from last. You know, it wasn't as if it was a race where the pace collapsed by any means. The winner sat second the entire way. The early leader, Pineapple Man, who's actually back in this field as well, tired late. So it was a good effort by Impressionist. You know, the interesting thing is that Rob Atras, who generally has good numbers in almost every category you could think of, is actually quite poor with second-time starters. And it's still a relatively small sample. You know, I don't want to condemn a trainer for a 15-horse sample, but he does have inordinately bad numbers with second-time starters. I wondered if Relate, who's getting Lasix and now draws outside, this is a horse who worked very, very quickly at auction, and I believe you made the morning line favorite, or one of the favorites in that race on December 5th. It looked like he was going to take a substantial amount of money, and he did, but I think the rail maybe ultimately dissuaded some people. I wondered if maybe he could turn the tables, being outside, being in more of kind of a free stalking spot rather than, and don't get me wrong, he had a perfectly fine trip on debut. I'm just wondering if he might benefit as much from having experience as the rail horse may, and I'm going to end up using both in the pick 5. I just felt like Relate might be a little bit better price.
Yeah, I do think he'll be a slightly better price in this race. I agree with you. They seem like the two with the most upside coming in here. I mean, nothing that clever. They both ran well in their debuts, and they seem fairly logical. I do prefer Impressionist. I'm likely taking the worst of it this time with regard to the price, whereas he was 10-1 in the debut. He's probably going to get bet down off that trip, which was fairly obvious, him blowing the start and making that big eye-catching run from the back of the pack. I just think this horse might be pretty good. I had liked him in his debut because I had thought he had worked well coming into that race. And even though he's the son of Mission Impossible, who's not a great sire, he's got a huge dam side pedigree. Really, all of the foals that this dam has thrown have been runners, including Conquest Mo Money, who was second in the Arkansas Derby. So I just feel like this horse might be okay. And if he breaks better this time, he's supposed to be pretty dangerous in here. Like you said, Rob Atras doesn't have great stats. I'm not putting too much stock in it because he really hasn't gotten that many young horses that have been well meant, probably not until really this past year when some owners like Michael Dove started sending him some more horses. But I'm not going to put too much stock in those stats. I mean, Also, Steve Asmussen, I mean, talking about the stats, he does not have great stats overall at Aqueduct in the wintertime. Especially with some of the young horses, you look up the maiden stats, second time starters. While Steve Asmussen, the barn overall, does well with second time starters in New York at this time of year, I feel like his horses tend to get overbet a little bit. So I was a little bit down on Relate because of that, but he can obviously take a step forward and win. I would kind of lean on both of these horses. The others in here didn't do that much for me. I was trying to make a case for the number 4, the Institute, who did show some promise in his debut and then has just been dreadful in his last 2 starts. I wonder if he's a horse that maybe is going to be helped by the addition of Lasix, because it seemed like something went badly wrong last time. In addition to the pace being fast, he just shut down, like he couldn't even like get air or stride out the end of that race. So I wonder if they figured out what's wrong with him, because he did show ability at one point, but it does seem like those second time starters might have the upper hand.
Yeah, I agree. The Institute was the other horse I was going to bring up because it was a scorching pace last time. That was, of course, the pace that Agility, who we were talking about, that won the December 5th a maiden race at Aqueduct, sat right on top of, and ultimately tired late. I foolishly I had bet Agility in that race, and I thought turning for home I was getting all the money, and all of a sudden she completely stopped. He completely stopped, and so did the Institute. I couldn't quite figure out what the chart caller was saying with the clip behind at the start. It was something that I had to really examine the head on to get, looking for any excuse here. But I do think ultimately what you said is probably the most viable excuse for him, which is that he might just be a bleeder, and the addition of Lasix could definitely make a difference. So nonetheless, I mean, even with the promising debut, based on what we saw from Impressionist and even Relate, this horse is going to have to improve to contend.
Yeah, I agree with that. Let's move on to race 6, the second leg of this sequence. It's a claiming 12,500 going 6 furlongs. One of the more competitive races that's part of this sequence. I guess that the favorite, just by default, is going to be the number 3 Summer Bourbon, given his string of competitive speed figures. And he's claimed off a low profile trainer by Linda Rice, who's had this horse in the past. Just feels like a very logical runner in here, but not the kind of horse that I would want to lean on at a short price, because there are some other options.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, and I think the interesting thing about this race is that two of the main contenders to me are Speeding Kid and Summer Bourbon, and they both come from barns that are just icy cold right now. I mean, it has been a very, very bad run for Wayne Potts. Last 3 months in New York, he's 1 for 37 with a 26-cent ROI, and Linda Rice is now 0 for her last 34 on the dirt at Aqueduct. So these are barns that, these are 15 to 20% barns. So these kind of numbers, obviously, these streaks will stop and they will start winning. But, you bring up these stats and we talk about things like this because these are the kind of stats you want to be aware of when you're taking prices on horses that might be a little bit less than you want. Now, I think that's more the case with Summer Bourbon than with Speeding Kid. Speeding Kid's a horse I could take at 6-1, even with Wayne Potts' recent struggles. I actually thought his effort last time was pretty good. That was the race where Irad put the apprentice down the backstretch, and pace ended up being very strong. Craig's Brooklyn Law came from the backfield to get the win, and Speeding Kid was really never out of it. He was kind of in the mix the entire way. I thought he ran quite well. Talking about how this race is going to get bet, and I'm sure you at least considered the idea that, on paper, Miss Alpha is supposed to be the favorite in this race. I just don't think for a second, and I agree with you, that this is a horse coming from Finger Lakes who's just not going to get that kind of support. So it does look as if he's kind of the main speed on paper. He comes in pretty good form with buyer speed figures that make him very, very competitive, if not the one to beat. I would use him. I would obviously use the two we've talked about as well, but I think the focus of my attention would be Speeding Kid.
Yeah, the Finger Lakes shippers are kind of an interesting wrinkle to this race, and you've got two of them towards the outside, and Fleet Warrior and Miss Alpha, because both have plenty of speed. I agree that the New York bettors are sometimes distrustful of these Finger Lakes shippers, so you get some value on them at times. They're not all competitive, but some of them can step up, and especially coming from the Chris Engelhardt barn, who trains Miss Alpha, he's one of the trainers that does seem to be able to translate that Finger Lakes form to Naira when he brings the right horse. So I do think he's an interesting player in this race. I agree that both Speeding Kid and Summer Bourbon are contenders here. Speeding Kid, I think my biggest problem with him is that he's just doesn't win races. I think he's lost 22 straight at this point after having some success early in his career at Canterbury Park. So it's just a little bit bothersome to me when a horse just keeps losing when he looks like he's in races that he's competitive in. And that coupled with the cold barn, I think is just another strike against him. But if he's around 6-1, 7-1, I'm not going to talk anybody off him. There are many ways to go in this race if you're going to be a little bit against a horse like Summer Bourbon. I mean, Miss Alpha, who we were just mentioning, coming in from Finger Lakes, he's one of those horses. Unlike Fleet Warrior, the other Finger Lakes shipper, Miss Alpha's actually kept some decent company at Finger Lakes. Those horses that he's faced, like Tommy the Torch, and especially Ladies Golden Guide 2 back and Saratoga Pal 3 back, they are pretty good horses. Saratoga Pal we saw win recently on the Naira circuit. Ladies Golden Guy, I think he's Bayard all the way up to 90 at Finger Lakes. So those are horses that would be pretty tough against this field. And Miss Alpha might actually be getting some class relief. It's just a matter of whether he can survive what could be a contested pace and bring that form to Naira. Many ways to go among some horses towards the middle of the field as well. I want to get your take on the number 4 Binkster, Nick, because he's coming out of the same race as Summer Bourbon, a horse that has plenty of back class races that would certainly make him competitive here. But I just wonder about how he's doing right now, the form, because they picked him up for 25 two back, and he's just kind of steadily been dropping off. And this was a reclaim by Ray Handel, so you'd imagine that they had some expectations they might be able to get this horse back to his best form, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the best horses that Ray Handel trained early in his career, and I'm sure there was a little bit of nostalgia, that factored into the claim. This is a horse that was taken for 25 off Dave Canizzo, and Ray Handel got him all the way up to the point where he earned a 97 buyer in April of 2019. So, I mean, you're talking about a horse with an immense amount of talent, just seems to have maybe lost it at this point. And he did not run well last time. That was kind of an ugly race that Cantrell Hill won from way off of it. Obviously, Gran Cacique came back and ran perfectly fine in his next start. He was in that race I was talking about with Speeding Kid. So I didn't have much of an excuse for Binkster that day. It's obviously the optics are not great going from 16 to 12.5, 2 starts after getting taken for 25. Obviously, even though they reclaimed him right away, it's just these are the kind of horses I generally try and avoid. And the other thing to me is that, the Binkster that you and I probably appreciated a few years ago was a horse with a pretty significant amount of speed. And one of the telltale signs on these veteran horses when they're kind of getting close to done is that they just don't really have much speed anymore. And that's kind of what I'm fearing we're seeing pretty regularly with Binkster, and that we might just see a little bit more of that.
Yeah, I have that fear as well, especially in a race where you've got a horse like Miss Alpha who does seem to be pretty fast to the outside, as well as Fleet Warrior, who's coming out of some 5 and 5.5, 4.5 furlong races. I mean, that horse is also pretty quick. The one thing I will say about Binkster's last race is it's not noted in the chart comments, but he was steadied pretty abruptly coming out of the starting gate. He was actually with the leaders for about 5 strides and then sort of got cut off, and that's why he was so far back in the early going. Dylan Davis really had to pull back on the reins, and the horse just kind of lost all position at the beginning of that race. So I don't think he ran that much worse than Summer Bourbon last time as they both come out of that race, and he'll be a much better price than Summer Bourbon. So I want to give him maybe more of a chance than that horse with just perhaps some better value built in with Binkster, but he's not a horse that I really trust that much. I'm hoping that the pace heats up a little bit, that a horse like Binkster has more speed, that we see speed from Karen's Cove again, those horses from the outside. So I want to look for a bit of a horse that can, for a bit of a closer that can pick them up late. And I'm interested at a price in the number 6 Winning Drive. I know that it looks like he hasn't done much running in his 2 starts since being claimed by Merrick Cantor-Massey, but it's worth taking apart those races a little bit. I mean, 2 back Store Advisory just kind of freaked, getting, I believe, back in the Rob Atris barn. And that was also a pretty slow paced race. That Winning Drive was just never really had a chance to get into racing at the back of the pack. And then last time they moved him up to the $25,000 level. That was a really tough race. Aristocratic's a good horse. Mitres Porciento was the favorite in there. He's much better than these horses. Just you go through that field and he's getting significant class relief coming out of that race. And it's not like he ran that badly. I know he finished 6th, but he was trying to make up some ground at the end. He did a little bit of running. And in the past, Winning Drive has had form that makes him competitive at this level. And I just think he's getting the class relief that he needs. And if the pace does heat up, he's one that I think will come running late. And he's got to be a big price in here with Heman Harkey riding. So he's one that I do want to include.
Yeah, I don't have any kind of case against that. I think that actually makes perfect sense. And the worth noting, as you mentioned, the difference in the fields between what he faced last time and this time is just immense. And additionally, when you're dealing with a horse like Aristocratic, who is a couple of years removed from nearly being stakes caliber, is he was isolated on the front end. So that's always going to be a pretty tough type of trip for a late running type. And if you think, as you laid out, there's a case to be made for the pace in here heating up, then he seems like a totally logical closer.
Moving on to race 7, a New York bred optional claiming 45,000, non-winners of 2 other than the allowance condition going 6.5 furlongs. Things don't get that much easier here. We've got another interesting pace situation, another race with a lot of contenders. I think the conversation probably should start with the number 2, Big Bobby, a horse that the bettors just seem to have a love affair with. They always bet this horse down to a reasonably short price, and that figures to happen once again here. He ran well enough last time at this level, moving up out of those nominators of 1 allowance races. He's never been out of the exacta. He always seems to run okay. I can't say that I've loved any of this horse's races, but he makes a certain amount of sense in here. He's just not the kind of horse that I would gravitate towards at a short price.
Yeah, I agree with that. I thought he ran really well last time. I did not like him that day at all, and foolishly bet Saratoga Pal over a couple of different horses in the exacta that included Bronx Bomber but didn't include Big Bobby. And I kind of felt like an idiot afterwards. And watching the replay, I actually did not realize what happened kind of behind him with both the Money in the Bank and Bronx Bomber. And I watched the replay shortly after the race and watched it again, handicapping this card. And I, like I said, I think Big Bobby ran very well. I think he's a horse that seems to have fired just about every time. He just doesn't exactly get your blood flowing at 5-2, right? I mean, I think that's kind of the problem, and it does look like there could be some more interesting horses in the race. It looks as if top to bottom it's going to be run at a pretty solid pace. I don't think that it's going to be nearly as fast as the race that a couple of these horses exit. I will say though that I thought More Grateful ran great last time, and this is a horse who I had generally been critical of in the past. I didn't really like when he was in Brad Cox's barn. I thought that his last start, first off the claim for Rob Atras, clearly showed a huge step forward. He's generally been a little bit better at Aqueduct. Atras also has really good numbers, second off the claim on the dirt. I think a lot of these trainers that really specialize at the claim box kind of figure out in one race what they have. And knowing that he had this 2 other than New York bred condition, provided he was in for the tag in his hip pocket, I think this was a pretty astute claim. I think this is a horse that's going to get an excellent trip from the outside. He's not going to be a big price by any means. I think he'll be the second choice, just as you made him on the morning line. And the other horse I'm going to use is T Loves a Fight. I actually liked T Loves a Fight a little bit last time behind Happy Medium, thinking that Happy Medium might get caught up in a pace duel, but Happy Medium is impervious to pace issues. Problem, of course, is T Loves a Fight's lost like a million races in a row. And I will say in his defense though, I think he's been over his head for the most part in a number of those races. I think getting back to New York bred company is really, really going to help his chances. And he might just be a placing chance, but he's one that I'll have to throw in on my tickets a little bit.
Yeah, I agree with your assessment of those major contenders. Big Bobby, he did run fine last time. He's just not a favorite that really speaks to me. So I was kind of looking to go against him. And in a pick 5 kind of sequence, if you can get around a horse like Big Bobby, you're probably going to really enhance your payout. So he's the kind of horse that I would want to de-emphasize to fade a little bit in the sequence and look for some other contenders that I find more appealing. And More Grateful is one of them for all the reasons that you laid out. I agree with what you said about Rob Atras off the claim and this horse being more of an Aqueduct specialist. He ran against 2 really good horses last time, and Ansarin and Zoomer, runners with back class that seem to kind of find their form for some hot barns. So More Grateful just seems like he might actually be getting into an easier spot coming out of that $40,000 open claiming race into this New York bred company. So I like him quite a bit. The one question I have with More Grateful is there's quite a bit of speed in this race to his inside. Bust and Shout is always quick out of the gate. He's likely to be pressing or perhaps on the lead. Both halves of the Ralph D'Alessandro entry, they have early speed. So we'll see how things shake out on the front end, but More Grateful, he is drawn well outside of those horses in that number 10 post position. Yeah, T Loves a Fight. don't really have a knock against his form. That I think it is a 28 race losing streak that does bother me a little bit. But he did get closest to winning when he ran at this condition last year, behind Wow Brown losing by a nose. So maybe the class relief really is the key with T loves to fight, and he's likely to get some pace to close into. But I wanted to search for a different closer. I gave a look to both those horses that you mentioned who had trouble behind Saratoga Pal in that December 3rd race. I thought that Bronx Bomber a little bit stymied making his run. Money in the Bank kind of shut off when he was trying to come on the outside, but Big Bobby kind of came over on him at the top of the stretch. So both of those horses somewhat hampered. I don't love for Bronx Bomber that the track seems likely to come up wet at Aqueduct on Saturday, and he's often been a horse that doesn't show up on muddy or sloppy tracks. So that bothers me a little bit with Bronx Bomber. Money in the Bank maybe a bit more reliable regardless of surface. But the closer that I liked the most was Durkin's Call. Just seems like a horse that really loves this 6.5 furlong distance. He didn't run well last time going the mile, and he is going out for that very cold Linda Rice barn that you talked about previously. But I didn't think he got the best ride last time for him. He's not a horse that likes to be rushed. He makes that one run from far back, and I just thought that Jose Lescano, he wasn't super aggressive, but he didn't put this horse in his usual position towards the back of the pack, and he just never really got the trip that he prefers in that race, fading after being too close to an honest pace. He ran really well in the 6.5 furlong races that he ran 3 and 4 back. Did not get much pace to close into behind Market Alert 3 back, and got the pace 4 back and delivered a big effort, one that is good enough to put him in the mix here. So I liked him turning back in distance and thought he would be a decent enough price off that poor effort last time.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. I don't think he appreciated really much being inside either. I suppose there's an argument that he could be a little bit hurt by a wet track also, but I don't know. I don't want to split hairs too much on that. Of the two horses that we talked about who had trouble in that race behind Big Bobby, I really prefer Money in the Bank, and I think that the potential wet surface has a little bit to do with that. The difference to me was that Money in the Bank was a lot closer to that pace early, and I think that's really what makes it that he ran a lot better. Bronx Bomber undoubtedly was caught in traffic, but he kind of got caught in traffic as the race was still being decided. It wasn't as if he was stuck when he really needed to get extricated from that spot to have a chance. So I would give Money in the Bank a little bit more of a look than Bronx Bomber, because I do think, as you said, that there's a reasonable chance that this pace could get quick.
Let's move on to the feature race on this card. It's the penultimate leg of the late pick 5 sequence, race 8, the Jerome, going 1 turn mile for the 3-year-olds. Pretty competitive field of 8 runners signed on. Maybe you've got a couple horses towards the middle of the pack, middle of the starting gate that are hard to make a case for, but I think you've got 6 runners in here that all look pretty similar in terms of speed figures and their resumes coming into this. The number 1 horse, Cook Creek, I would imagine will be the favorite in this race. He just really has done nothing wrong through 3 starts, seems to be stepping forward with each race. The mile seems like a good distance for him. Just has to contend with the rail draw coming out of that chute going the 1 turn mile, but I'm not going to be too hard on him for that. Cook Creek just seems super logical.
Yeah, totally agree. I actually picked him on top. I wish I had a better, more clever horse to latch on to, because he is more than likely be the favorite. But we've seen Jeremiah O'Dwyer do well in Derby preps in New York in the past. He won the Remsen a couple of years ago with Shotsky. So yeah, I thought Cook Creek was. I thought his win in the Rocky Run was actually pretty solid, and then in the Nashua, the rail was good that day. And I think that conversation comes up dealing with a couple of horses in here, Cook Creek and Unbridled Bomber, because Cook Creek was actually never inside. So I think he ran a very, very good race, all things considered. Unbridled Bomber, who broke his maiden earlier on that card, came right up the rail. And we've seen a number of runbacks, to me, that I was a little unsure if that was a good rail. I think the runbacks have shown that it was pretty solid. I think it enhanced the performances of horses like Unbridled Bomber. So I thought Cook Creek was very obvious. Mr. Jefferson, I felt like, was a horse that I wanted to use, as well as Cavassier. Cavassier comes in off a really solid maiden win. Now I understand that they were really staggering home that day, but being, of course, that this is the TimeformUS podcast, the TimeformUS numbers would show you that was a very, very strong pace. And it played out that way, as those horses were generally looking for a place to lie down around the quarter pole. And I thought that Mr. Jefferson, all things considered, ran very well with the complete opposite pace setup in the Remsen, where they went very slow early, and he was never really going to put a scare into Mo Donegal or Zandon anyway. I think moving back to the mile will really help his chances. The horse that I was interested in hearing what you have to say about, I picked him 4th. I'm very skeptical of Hagler in here, and I'm really not sure what I want to do with him.
Yeah, among those that are going to take money, the horses that I want no part of are Hagler and 02035. Hagler, I'm very skeptical of this horse's overall quality and of his ability to go the mile. I mean, he's really more of a sprinter based on pedigree. He's a full brother to Sky of Hook, who raced for these same connections and was a stakes winner going 6 furlongs. Really could not go a step beyond that. Hagler did get a pretty uh, high speed figure for his win two back against Maiden Company, but that's a race that just has not held up at all, no matter what speed figures you look at. Everybody, except for a horse that stretched way out in distance, that finished way back in the pack, Perfect Flight, everybody else has just taken a big step backwards coming out of that race, including the runner up, Iconic Adventure, and Dad's Good Runner. I just think that maybe that was a pretty weak maiden field. And Hagler came back last time as the justifiable 1-5 favorite, and that was kind of an ugly win. I mean, he set a slow pace. You'd imagine a horse that looked that superior on paper would be able to sprint away from that field over the final quarter, getting those easy fractions, and he really had to work for it. I don't know. Now they're running back in 2 weeks. I'm very skeptical of this horse getting the mile, especially if the pace is anything close to moderate or honest. So I was against Hagler and 02035. He has a son of Union Rags switching to dirt. So maybe you want to give him a look just for that reason alone, because the Union Rags typically are much better dirt than turf. But the damn side pedigree on this horse is all European turf breeding, and they sent this horse right to turf as Union Rags. I don't think that's a good sign. So I wanted to veer away from both of these horses if they take any money at all and go towards some of the more logical horses with dirt route form. And you mentioned some viable contenders, Cook Creek. I have no argument with him. He just seems like a very logical player. Mr. Jefferson, the other horse that you were talking about, I think that he also makes plenty of sense. Ran well enough in the Remsen last time. The turn back to the 1 turn mile should suit him, and just seems like the kind of horse for Mike Trombetta that has been a little bit green, got some more focus with the blinkers in his last couple starts, and just could be figuring things out. The horse, though, that interests me most at a price, and I do think it's worth having a discussion about that rail on November 7th, because I I'm not totally convinced. There were only 4 dirt races on that November 7th card when they ran the Nashua. It was one of those days they ran a lot more turf races. So I just have trouble making biased declarations when there are only 4 or 3 dirt races. And a couple of the dirt races that really did seem to play towards the rail were the 2-year-old races without a lot of form coming into them. There was one race for older horses that really did not play like it had a rail bias at all. So I'm a little skeptical that the rail was actually good that day. I know that you might point to the horse Authorized that finished behind Unbridled Bomber as the main piece of evidence that the rail was bad. The rail was good, I should say, because he came back to run so badly in his next start. But Authorized was part of that ridiculous pace in the Cravassier race, and he was eased in that race. Something clearly went wrong with him, aside from the fact that it was just him regressing off a potential good rail trip in his debut. So I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical about the rail. I'm going really into the weeds on that because I want to get to a discussion of the number 2 Unbridled Bomber, who I actually think is very interesting in this race, and I picked him on top. I believe he'll be the best price of the horses that I'm considering, and that's the reason that I'm putting him on top. But I also think he's just a horse for low profile connections that has slowly but surely been figuring things out. He obviously wanted no part of sprinting in his debut. They stretched him all the way out to 1.125 in his second start, a big ask, and he just didn't have the fitness to go that far. He's kind of this big, gangly, goofy horse that wants to lug in his races, but his last 2 efforts, I think he's really stepped it up. I mean, he didn't get close to Judge Davis 2 back, but if you watch that race, he did some sneaky running at the end after racing very greenly. And then last time, he finally figured it out and was much more in the bridle right from the start and made that run up the inside to get it done. Maybe the rail carried him if indeed the rail was good that day, but he just seems like a horse that really relishes these added distances. And if there's pace in this race, which I think it's possible that there could be, he's the closer that I wanted the most if he's somewhere in that 7, 8, 9 to 1 range. And I think he'll be that price.
Yeah, look, I hear you for sure. I thought he got a big pace setup last time as well. You never know; they may
Mhm.
end up going somewhat quickly in here with Hagler potentially getting some pressure on the front end. So we will certainly see how that shakes out. I respect your opinion, and yeah, I agree on you with 02035. This is a horse with no reason to believe he's going to get better on the dirt. And if there had even been an attempt to try earlier in his career, maybe that'd make me feel a little bit better. But there was definitely not.
close things out with the final leg of this pick five sequence. Race nine, a New York bred allowance nominated one other than for the Fillies going 6 furlongs, and a race that I really struggled with because I can't say that I love anybody that much. I guess Towering Orbit is the one to catch, but I can't say that I've been thrilled with her two efforts since she stepped up against winners. She ran okay two back on a day when you probably didn't want to be down inside or showing speed. But last time out, maybe Jose Ortiz just wasn't aggressive enough, but I didn't like that she got passed so early, coming around the far turn by the eventual winner. And I mean, she'll be in front in this race, you would imagine, if they're as aggressive as they should be on her. But I just question her overall quality.
Yeah, I totally agree. I thought her last race was pretty dull. That was a race where Chasing Cara took a ton of support at the windows and ran to it, and Towering Orbit just didn't really have much to offer when push came to shove. So I was a little, I guess you could say, disappointed with that race. I have to try Snicket in here. I'm the president of the Dave Duggan fan club, and I know Snicket. You want to talk about horses that don't like to win? Snicket is the poster child of those types. But I actually think she's a horse that when you start to dig into what she's done on the racetrack, there's a lot there. And she was wide 3 starts back in her last dirt start at Belmont. That was opening weekend, especially the Saturday of opening weekend. You wanted to be inside. She was 3 paths wide the entire way. Prior dirt start to that, she actually ran very well, missing by a nose to Breakfast at Bonnie's, who's a huge favorite by Hubby Hello Money. Came out of that race, ultimately won a stake race down the line. So Duggan has very good numbers first off of trainer changes on the dirt. And, the interesting thing to me about this horse is that I think the public is going to perceive this trainer change as a downgrade, and it's not. And that's not me saying anything about Christophe Clement, but Dave Duggan is very,
Mhm.
very good with a limited number of horses. So I wanted to use Snicket. I also like Ancient Brown. And my thought on Ancient Brown is that 2 starts back, she was inside. That was the day that you referenced the race with Towering Orbit. You didn't want to be inside that day. She was inside much of the way, then tried the turf last time out with no success. No big deal to me. I know they came at Belterra, but her wins 3 and 4 starts back, speed figure wise, actually make her very competitive in here. And I think she's going to get a good trip from just off the pace. So she was kind of my interesting price. I feel like ultimately in this pick five, I'll use the 2, 3, 4, and 5, the 2 and 3 just as more of the main focus, because as much as I tried to make anybody else in the field, I couldn't really do it. I thought there were cases to be made for a few, though.
Yeah, I actually don't have a whole lot to add because we have positive things to say about many of the same horses in here. I'm also interested in Ancient Brown as my long shot here for everything that you said. That trip two back was just not what you wanted that day. Irad put her right on the rail and basically glued her to the rail the entire way. She really never had a chance to run. I doubt. I have my doubts that Ancient Brown is this good, but I do think she's going to be every bit of that 15 to 1, especially with Benji Hernandez riding. So she's definitely a horse that I do want to use in the sequence. And I agree, I've never been much of a Snicket fan, but looking through this race, and if you take out all those turf efforts that kind of cloud up her form, her dirt races give her a big chance in here. So she's not a winning type, but I think that there are positive things to say about Snicket. Yeah, the horses that are going to take money, like Electric Youth and Highway Queen, they don't do a whole lot for me. Electric Youth got a great pace setup last time, and I know she got a big buyer for that race. I have some doubts about the overall quality of that starter allowance field. She's probably making a lateral move here, but we'll see if she gets that same kind of pace setup this time. And Highway Queen, I know people are going to look at the fact that she's got this string of superior speed figures on the turf, and she's got that one big fig when she went a mile and an eighth on the dirt. So they're going to extrapolate that she's just as good on the dirt as she is on the turf. I don't know about that. That one big dirt fig that she earned at Saratoga was for the Mike Maker barn at a time when Mike Maker was winning with everything through the first half of the Saratoga meet, including, it seemed like, every off the turf race. And I'm just a little bit concerned about Highway Queen repeating that dirt race in her current barn, switching from turf to dirt after they really kind of concentrate on her being a turf horse. So I thought she'd take some money in here, and I was a little bit against her. And yeah, I agree with you, Nick. I'm going to mostly focus on Snicket and reluctantly Towering Orbit, who I just looks pretty loose in here and is likely to be the one to catch. And I would use Ancient Brown as a long shot to get into the mix.
Yeah, totally agree, and I agree with the sentiment on Highway Queen, who I think is a horse that the more you pick apart her form, the stronger you feel about really being against her. So I thought, hopefully it's a race we could be relatively simple with how we can approach it.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty difficult sequence to put a ticket together. There are not too many races where I feel like I can narrow it down to just one horse. I mean, maybe the first leg I would lean on Impressionist a little bit, even though he's going to be a short price. I do think he's one of the more likely winners in the sequence. But later on, there are some price horses I want to use. I want to de-emphasize some favorites. So it's one of those tickets where you're going to have to get maybe a little bit creative with your ticket construction. But it definitely seems like a sequence that could pay well if we're right with a few of our opinions.
Undoubtedly, yeah. I think it's actually a fun one, and if you've got an opinion or two, you can kind of hone in on a little bit. I think you can really end up making it for a pretty lucrative sequence. Which, look, this time of year, these are not in abundance, so good to see one.
Well, Nick, I really appreciate you coming back on the podcast. Good luck with the new gig at Sam Houston starting next week. I'll be listening, as I'm sure many of our listeners will be. So thanks for coming on, Nick.
Pleasure was all mine, David. Thanks for having me. I look forward to joining you again in the future.
Remember that you can always catch these Timeform US podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in this week, and look forward to some podcasts next week when I believe my usual co-host, Greg Milkowski, will be returning, but we'll announce that schedule on Twitter. So everybody, Happy New Year, and look forward to discussing more racing in 2022.